In this video, we're going to create a grid of shapes in Cavalry, then blow it up, or collapse it. Hi, I'm Adam Burnett, this is the Video Shop. I recently used Cavalry for this. The whole thing is a mix of Blender and After Effects, and I'll go through the process in my next video. But this part here was done in Cavalry. Most of the process is very simple, but there are a couple of things I bumped up against, so I thought I'd help you avoid doing the same. Essentially, we'll look at creating a grid, which consists of both standard Cavalry shapes and custom vectors, and randomizing the shapes and colors, then exploding that grid, or collapsing it, or whatever. Okay, let's get started. Let's start off with this basic animation here, which is just a grid collapsing, grid of shapes, and then we'll look at the random colors and putting customized shapes into there as well, and then blowing up. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you, gold star for those of you who have noticed that there's issues with the collision shapes here. We'll come back to that, I am aware of that, but deal with that later on. So we've got a blank comp here, and I'm just gonna hold shift down and draw some shapes. I'm kind of eyeballing it, so they're all roughly the same size, but they may need adjusting when they're in the grid, but that's fine. So we've got all our basic shapes here. There are other shapes that aren't on this list. So if we go over to here, so we've got a capsule shape. All of these shapes, it's got a drop down for the shape type, and there's a couple of others which aren't listed here that you might want to try out. Super shape doesn't come with its own homemade costume and cape, unfortunately. But what we'll do is we'll just leave it with these shapes here for now. To create a grid, we can just select all of those shapes and then click up here. And we're sort of struggling to see them because they're so close together and large. So we'll bump up the size of our grid first of all. So I'm putting 800 in here, and then if I Alt-Enter, that'll sort of enter on both counts. Alternatively, you can hold Alt down while you drag the value, which works as well. I think we might need to bump up the value here. Okay, and they are intersecting. So for this example, let's just stick with 4 across and down. So you can already see potentially some issues with creating sort of like a perfect grid where everything is centered in screen. But that's something we're going to look at shortly. But if we want to animate these with Forge Dynamics, all we need to do is, with the duplicator selected, just hit there and then spacebar to play, and it's just going to drop all those shapes down. So to do a basic animation is really simple. It's quite nice. But now we've got these issues where we want to sort of make our grid a bit more bespoke. This is where I'm going to suggest having each shape in its own folder before you add it, because there's another issue that you might bump up against, which I did, which is if we go here, grid. So here's one ready to animate, but maybe you want all the shapes to be smaller, for example. Now you can go into the duplicator and you've got shape size, shape scale here. Okay, that's kind of sort of similar to what I was looking for with mine. But then you've got sort of the individual scales of these as well. And, you know, like the hexagon, for example, is looking a little bit too big. So I can't actually go onto the hexagon and adjust the scale. It's not making any difference because it's in the duplicator. You know, you can adjust these radius values, and that's fine. But then when you get to more complicated shapes, such as the super shape, various other shapes like there's a cog, for example, that's not ideal either. So the better way to do it actually would be to sort of alt click, because then each shape is centered. So we'll create another one, circle. So now they're stacked on top of each other, so you can't see them. And if we put each one into its own folder, we've got the shortcut Control G, so we can just select each one, and you can rename these folders as well. I'll fast forward through that bit, and I might add a couple more. You might think it's a pain having these all stacked on top of each other like this, but you'll see why shortly. There's no option to solo layers on the left here like other software you might be used to, but I just looked this up, and Cavalry in one of their videos they point out that you can with the shape selected. So let's just grab our circle here. We can Alt W, which kind of solos it in the viewport. Okay, so let's do the same thing again. We'll just pop these into a duplicator. Amend these values. And so this is the benefit, well, this is going to be the benefit of having separate folders, because there's a couple of issues. I'd like this half pipe, as I'm calling it, to be centered rather than sort of aligned at the bottom here. The triangles are a bit too far up, and I want to sort of adjust the scale of certain things as well. So if I go to the square, the scaling is now working because it's in a folder, and then the triangle, now I can just move it down. So you can make individual adjustments to particular shapes depending on what you want to do. Let's just do that half pipe. And maybe have it rotated as well. Okay, and I can bung that into Forge Dynamics, and so that's going to work. So you've got more control over the individual shapes. Let's look at custom shapes quickly. So I'll delete the Forge Dynamics, but I'll leave the duplicator on. We'll just add certain shapes. So you can bring in a reference, and that's what I did for what I was working on. So I had a rendered out reference, and then just used the pen tool and kind of did that. I might do the whole thing over again. So I ended up with this. Now, one thing I bumped up against, and I don't know whether it was the way that my tools were sort of set up, but you've got the pen tool here, and then you've got the sort of select vertex point tool. And let's say you wanted to sort of scale, 3 vertex points to make one adjustment, and I was selecting, double clicking, I wasn't seeing the bounding box that you're used to seeing, and that's just that transform tool checkbox here. So if you bump up against the same thing, you just need to make sure you have that selected. Anyway, just one more thing I want to show you quickly before we move on is if you want to do custom shapes, if it's easier to take a shape that already exists as a sort of a simple sort of primitive or whatever, you can go up to shape and then make editable, and then do it that way if you want. Now, if you want to change them from corner points to Bezier, you can go here, shape, and convert to Bezier points, and then you've got this. Now, another thing to just be aware of when you've got your duplicator is using the shape scale here. So if you decided you wanted to, don't want to do that, just scale them all down within the duplicator shape scale here, Forge Dynamics is just going to override that. So that's something to bear in mind. If you're not using Forge Dynamics, it doesn't matter and you don't need to worry about this stuff, but it's just kind of future-proofing it if you do want to create collision events with your shapes. So while these shapes might look random as in randomly distributed, they're actually not. And if we adjust the count and the amount here, we can see that. So to have them randomly distributed in the grid, we need to uncheck auto ID, fun pattern there, and go right click on the shape ID, and we'll add random to the shape ID. So that's giving us a random effector, and the minimum and maximum values relate to the input shapes that we've got in our duplicator. So if our minimum and maximum was 0, we'd just have the first shape, which I've called hilariously a throwing star. If we put the maximum at 1, it's going to alternate between 2 shapes, which is going to be the throwing star and the half pipe. Now we can reorder these. So if we wanted triangle and circle, we can reorder them, but we want all 7 shapes here. So we want to go from 0 to 6, which is 7 in total. And so this is now totally random. You can adjust the seed if you're not happy with that. If you go above the maximum, you're going to see more of the first shape in the list. So basically it's going to sort of randomly go through all of them, but then for all of the numbers above the maximum number of shapes, it's going to keep reverting back to the first one. So if we bump this up enough, it's going to be pretty much just all triangles. So that's just something to be conscious of. You have to have the exact number of shapes that you've got in there. So that's how to randomly distribute them in a grid. What about if we wanted random rotation? I've got another grid set up with some similar shapes in it. So for example, these triangles, what if we wanted some of them to be pointing down, and these half pipes, some of them to be facing this way and some of them to be facing the other way? We can use a value array for that, and there's a couple of ways that we can apply it to the duplicator shapes. You can either click here, or even control full stop to bring that up. Can't remember if I did that earlier on. And type in value array, that'll bring up a value array here. Or in the duplicator itself, we can go to the shape rotation and right click, add array, value array, and then that's already plugged in to the shape rotation there. So at the moment we've got, with our value array, we've got just one value set to 0, and if we just increase that, it's rotating all of the shapes. So we leave that at 0, then add another one, and then the second one. So you can see that it's applying it to every other shape in the grid, or maybe you can't. So let's set that to 180. So this is what we want. We've got some of these triangles are facing up, some of them are facing down, and then these half pipes as well. It's not affecting the other shapes, but that's fine. But again, it's still not random, even though it kind of looks random because we've got random shapes. But if we wanted these to be applied in a random way, what we need to do is uncheck auto index and right click on the array index and add behavior random. And by default, the minimum and maximum values for that randomness are what we want. We've got 2 values for the array, so that's fine. And so we've now got it randomly applied. We can see that some of the half pipes are facing that way, some are facing that way, so this is what we want. And just to tidy this up, what I'll do is drop the random into the array, and then the array just into the duplicator, and we can turn that off so that it's back the way it was, but we'll leave it like that. Next, let's add colour to these shapes, and if you're lazy like me, you could use a site like Coolors to find a colour palette. So if we explore what's trending, what's going to look good on the thumbnail? Yeah. I mean, 20,000 people can't be wrong. Okay, we can export as an ASE, and if I pop that into a folder, I can import it here. And maybe rename that. So to apply those colours to the shapes, first I need to create a colour array, and can do that this way. Okay, so we've got a colour array here, and to make sure that's random, we can uncheck auto index and then right click on index, add behavior random, and this random already has the minimum and maximum values are set as we want them. So there's 0 to 4 colors, 0 to 4 minimum max, and again, just housekeeping, just going to drop that random into the color array there. So now I just need to apply this color array to the shapes, and gonna just connect from here to the torus, and then stroke color, and then fill, just one by one. Okay, wow, that really is pretty bold. So lastly, so again, I'm going to just pop that in the duplicator, again, for housekeeping. And then lastly, just offset this grid a little bit. So I've got pattern offset here. Okay. And now we're pretty much ready to add the dynamics. Right, so let's collapse these shapes first, because that's the easiest thing to do. With the duplicator selected, I'm just going to click up here on Forge Dynamics. Turns off the duplicator, we've got Forge Dynamics here, and if we press play with the spacebar, they just drop down, easy. Over here we've got ground mode. If we just leave it at composition bottom, then the ones at the side won't disappear. And I mean, that's not bad for what we want. You could add some fields into the mix if you wanted to by clicking here, and we're going to use the attractor to explode them. So let's maybe just see what the drag field does quickly. So if we double click on here, we're going to add a fall off, right click, fall off, and I'll change that from a circle to a rectangle, and then just gonna zoom out and then just bump up the scale of that rectangle, and move it up here. Okay, so that doesn't look like it's doing much at the moment. But if we double click on that drag field and set it to a minus amount and then just bump up the force, we should start to see something. Okay, so the drag works with the inherent velocity of the dynamic shapes here. So because there's gravity already acting on it, it's just sort of increasing that. So that's probably a bit much, but you could play around with the settings and maybe knock it down a little bit, but just gives it a bit more oomph. So to explode it, similar process. Click on Forge Dynamics again, and we're going to remove the gravity and turn that off. So it's not going to do anything until we add a field. Going to use an attractor field this time, double click on it, add the fall off, just housekeeping again, just pop that in there. We'll leave all these settings the same for now and just whack up the strength to maybe 1200, see what happens. Okay, I forgot to set it to minus 1200, so it's repelling rather than attracting. Okay, so that's not doing anything. That's because the fall off is here and I'm an idiot. So let's just go into the fall off and just increase that scale to like that. Okay, and finally, I mean, we could maybe increase the strength of the fall off. I'm just clicking around to see what works. Okay, so that's not a big enough explosion. Maybe the scale even more, and then this, how about minus 2400? Okay, well, I'll let you mess around with the settings and play around yourselves. So lastly, let's have a look at the issues that you might encounter with collision shapes, depending on the shapes that you're using. So if we have just a bunch of stars like this, we're going to get something like that, where Forge Dynamics and most dynamic apps don't support concave holes. I'm quoting Chris word for word there, because I don't know what I'm talking about. So essentially, when it calculates the collisions, this is what it's doing here. Okay, so a workaround for that is to, and depending on how much time or patience you've got, and the thing is, when you've got shapes that are this small, and depending on how quickly you see them on screen, you're not really going to notice that stuff, but if you've got big shapes on screen, it's going to be more obvious. So here, I've created a star just out of separate editable shapes, then put that in a group, and so they're all in a duplicator group. So then if we add Forge Dynamics to that, drop them down, and they're intersecting as they should be. So similarly, if you want them to gather in something like a bowl, then we've got a bowl here which is just made up of separate rectangle shapes, and we'll get something like that. Obviously that's not very bowl shaped, is it? So here what we can do, and again sort of another sort of hacky solution, is put a single rectangle shape in a duplicator, set the distribution from grid to a circle, and then I've adjusted the radius, angles, and if I just bump up the count, then we have a bowl, and then can go up to shape and separate. Takes a second, but then it gives us a bowl with all those individual shapes. So now we've got our stars up here, we've got our bowl down here. Select both of those, put it into Forge Dynamics, and that's it. There's a link in the description for the free project file if you want it. I'll be exploring Cavalry more in upcoming videos. Huge thanks to Chris at Cavalry and Mario De Maya on the Cavalry Discord for tolerating my inane questions. Hope this was useful. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.